We found a new location in Nepal, which hasn't been filmed at before in any great great quantity. And at that location, we were able to film the tigers from the air with drones, which is something which you're not able to do in most parts of India. And that meant we could show the tigers in a new way. So it's a familiar creature, but in a new place, and filmed in a way that meant we could reveal new behaviours, and that's really exciting for me as well. So I'm just as excited about a new creature that's not been seen before as a really familiar creature that we're able to show people in a different light.
Hey there, Podcast Aquanauts. It's your host, Casey here. From planet Earth and the life of birds to walking with dinosaurs, there's something I've always found incredibly thrilling about the documentary films and TV series produced by BBC's Natural History Unit. Whether it's showing marine iguanas dodging snakes in a race to reach the sea, or highlighting the plucky perseverance of the humble weed, the filmmakers of this storied studio have been capturing nature at its finest for almost 70 years. Yet until recently, despite training their lenses on seemingly every habitat and species imaginable, one gaping hole existed in the Natural History Unit's coverage: Asia. A few years ago, BBC filmmakers undertook a multi-year effort to explore the world's largest continent. This resulted in a 7-part TV series titled simply and appropriately Asia. Now, BBC Earth has produced a film, Wild Asia: Life at Extremes, that's soon to appear at the Tennessee Aquarium IMAX 3D theater. This film offers a condensed greatest hits take on the series, whisking viewers on a 40-minute voyage across the entire continent. In this episode, we'll chat with BBC's Matthew Wright, who acted as series producer for Asia and director of Wild Asia: Life at Extremes. We'll discuss the challenges of filming in such a variety of locations, his favorite moments from the film, and the logistics of capturing never-before-seen behavior in the Coral Triangle. I think that sounds pretty thrilling, so let's get to it, shall we? On with the podcast. Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Podcast Aquatic, the official podcast of the Tennessee Aquarium. Today, as you can probably tell, my voice is suffering the effects of a little bit of a bug, but we're going to soldier on. And today we have a special guest, Matthew Wright, who is the director of BBC Earth's Wild Asia: Life at Extremes, which is going to begin daily screenings at our IMAX 3D theater on Friday, May 15th. And Matthew, you will be actually coming to visit us here in Chattanooga on May 5th, which is a Tuesday, I believe, for a special meet and greet screening of the film. And then I think you're going to do a post-film presentation.
Yeah, that's right. I'm really, really looking forward to coming over.
Now, have you ever been to Chattanooga before? This'll be your first time, or?
It's my first time in Chattanooga. I have been to Knoxville before, several years ago for filming, so I have been in Tennessee, but it's been a good long while since that was the case.
All right, well, so as I said, you are involved with Wild Asia: Life at Extremes, but you also had a role in the TV series also called Wild Asia. This is all out of BBC Studios. You are a producer on the TV series, but you directed the film. So what is your background as a filmmaker? What drew you to the craft, and what was your origin story?
Ever since I was a little kid, like maybe literally 5 years old, I always was fascinated by television primarily. I used to pretend I had a camera when I was at school and running up. Other kids were playing ball games like soccer, and instead of joining in, I would literally be running along the sidelines pretending to film them on this kind of imaginary invisible camera, which is kind of slightly strange behavior when you look back. But I was always fascinated watching TV and movies as to kind of how they got made and, what was involved in putting those things together. And then as I progressed through school, I was reasonably academic, and I found the sciences fascinating. And I did a scientific degree with a kind of biology background, but all the time at the back of my mind thinking that filmmaking was still something that I was interested in, but was perhaps something that happened to other people. It's quite hard, especially pre-internet, to figure out how you maybe got into it. But when I graduated, I did decide I'd give myself a year to try and somehow worm my way into some sort of role in television production. And if that didn't work out, I'd try and do a more normal career. And I was fortunate that I was based in London. There's a lot of television production out of London in the UK, and I was able, by writing lots and lots and lots and lots of letters offering to work for free, basically as an intern, to gain just a 2-week placement. And then from there it kind of spiraled. This was in live daytime television, so nothing to do with science, but through contacts I made as I slowly climbed up the ladder in London, I was able to then, after a couple of years, make a move to Bristol, which is a mid-sized town. It's maybe like the 10th largest town in the UK, roughly, in western Western England, a couple of hours drive from London. And for some historical reason in Bristol, there's a really large community of wildlife filmmakers. I think we make about half of the wildlife films in the whole world, half of the wildlife television and films, which is kind of crazy. It's mainly because the BBC Natural History Unit set up here around 70 years ago. And as a result of that, there's just been a groundswell of folks who are trained in this kind of filmmaking. So I moved out to Bristol to take on a very junior role in a small production company. There's loads of production companies here, not just the BBC. And that was in my early 20s. And I've worked my way up through the industry. I moved across to the BBC getting on for sort of 14, 15 years ago. And I've been largely in the BBC ever since, although most of us move around. We're a flexible workforce. We don't tend to have staff positions. So yeah, that's my kind of origin story. Everyone here tends to have a slightly weird story because there's not really any sort of defined routes in. There's not many job ads that say wanted wildlife television producer. You have to kick your way in, and most people have got scientific backgrounds, but certainly not all.
So how does having the scientific background inform your approach to filmmaking? Does that give you a perspective as a filmmaker that you think you might lack otherwise?
Do you know what? I don't think it's essential. And some really strong filmmakers here who've got English literature background or arts backgrounds or no university college education at all. But it has benefited me. I find it helpful, particularly in talking to scientists and citizen scientists about stories they might know of, and it also helps me to read scientific papers quite quickly and kind of get a grip on what the stories might be within that, because we need to source our stories. And although increasingly we're doing that through looking at social media and finding people on the internet, there's still a large number of stories we find through collaboration with the scientific community, people who are who've been tasked with studying different animals and are maybe in the field half the year, and they're seeing things that are of interest to us. So it helps me communicate with them, and perhaps it helps me just get a sense of whether a story rings true. You might see something on social media and you think, is that a total one-off, that this event that's been filmed has happened, or is this something which feasibly might be recurring, and so something we might be able to film? So I think it helps having a scientific background, but it's by no means essential.
It sounds like it gives you the literacy to act as a kind of a translator to the public, though, right? By understanding science, you can help other people understand science.
Exactly, and it's quite good having a foot in both camps, because I'm sure we've all met scientists who are the most fantastic scientists, and they've got a real grasp of the data and they're making remarkable discoveries, but maybe as communicators they're so wrapped up in the science that sometimes they forget what your average man or woman on the street knows or is interested in. So we have to kind of disseminate what's interesting. Is it interesting scientifically? That's great, but is it also interesting in terms of an entertainment value?
Sure. Yeah, I've met plenty of those scientists. Even here, I have wonderful coworkers who they speak science with great fluency, and it's as if they somehow forget to speak English in the process. So you're absolutely right. It's a language almost unto itself, and being able to act as a go-between is a really important role. As I said, or as you said, I guess, you worked with BBC Studios' Natural History Unit, which for a lot of people, myself included, that's the sort of introduction a lot of us have had to documentary filmmaking in the last, you said 70 years it's been around. I was introduced to it personally back in the early 2000s through Planet Earth and Blue Planet, Life of Mammals, I think Life of Birds as well. So it just seems like an incredible place, an incredibly special place to work, an incredible group of people to work with. What is it like making films with the Natural History Unit compared to maybe other outfits with which you've worked?
There's some really great outfits in Bristol, and I have worked across a number of them. And the people move around between the companies. So in terms of the folks that you find in those companies, there's not a huge difference, because I could be somewhere else next year and then back here 2 years later. But what is different about the BBC Natural History Unit is its legacy and its size, I would say. So we have this history going back several decades, and we also have an enormous workforce because we've got a lot of work on. So what that means is, if I am going to go and film hummingbirds, there will be several people within the BBC Natural History Unit who I can go to and say, hey, these birds are fantastic, but they move really fast and the light levels are pretty low. Have you got any tips? Where did you go and film them? What equipment did you use? Do you know any camera operators who are just hummingbird masters? There's always somebody, or almost always somebody, who's filmed a variant of what you're interested in filming, and there's a real air of collaboration. We're all working together on different projects for different broadcasters, but it doesn't mean we can't share our sort of personal knowledge. So there's just this fantastic hive mind, this knowledge bank within the unit who we can go to, and it makes things really efficient, and it means we might be able to film stories, new stories that we wouldn't otherwise be able to film. So that's what I love about being here, is the collaborative nature and just the sheer wealth of knowledge we've got to draw on. That's
incredible. I mean, just to have that resource at your disposal has got to be just very freeing as a filmmaker. What's interesting to me, though, to get more around to the point, which is obviously we want to talk about Wild Asia. Asia was a subject that, at least based on the readings I've done leading up to this conversation, was not a target of a BBC documentary up until Wild Asia premiered back in 2024. Why is that? I mean, is it just a logistical matter? Was it too large a story to try and tell? Was it difficult to find places to film? Were you restricted in the places you were allowed to go? I mean, what were the challenges that had to be overcome to open the door to doing a project about the continent of Asia, like Wild Asia?
Yeah, it's certainly a challenging place to film, but most continents have got their own challenges. I can't really speculate as to why it hadn't been covered before. It's something we kind of scratched our heads on when we came to the project, because it felt like such a no-brainer. Certainly historically, some of the countries in Asia have been harder to access than some of the countries in other continents. But in terms of the natural history of the continent, it's just incredible. It's a kind of nexus. It's like a meeting place between Africa and Europe. And then even in the East, it kind of practically touches North America as well over the Bering Strait. So you get these fantastic flow of animals across Asia and a real variety. You've got kind of more big cat species in Africa. You've got almost, like 5 out of the 7 species of bear. I think it's just a glut of creatures. So quite why it hadn't been featured, I'm not sure, but certainly there's a lot of countries to cover, and perhaps because historically it hasn't been covered as much as, say, Africa or the United States, there's a bit of there's a lack of local resourcing, perhaps because we haven't filmed there before. There's not so many folks, or hadn't historically been so many folks in Asia who are doing things like citizen science, or local camera operators who are passionate in capturing footage locally, which we can then pick up on and use to sort of commission a full sequence from. But that has changed, and we found a tremendous number of passionate citizen scientists in Asia. People who are filming things on their phones and posting them on Instagram, people who have self-trained and are shooting amazing material on their own equipment. So we really found this, I think we hit it at the right time. Basically, we found that the continent is pretty passionate about wildlife. So it was a privilege to kind of go first. I mean, I think what flagged it to us was that there was a series that went out a few years prior to 2024 called 7 Worlds. And that was a 7-part series that the BBC produced that took each continent, and each continent had an episode. And when the production team kind of reported back and did a debrief afterwards, they said, well, look, the one episode that was just overflowing was the Asia episode. Like, why have we not tapped into this? And that was the kind of seed that was planted that then led to the wider Asia series being developed.
You mentioned that the nice thing about tackling projects with the Natural History Unit is that you do have that wealth of previous experience upon which to draw. Was the opposite the case with Asia? I mean, were you laying a lot of the groundwork? Were you the one doing the pioneering work for those future projects that are going to follow Wild Asia? Like, was it harder to get started just because there was so little previous experience and previous resources upon which you could rely to kind of direct your efforts?
Well, there's 2 sides to this. So if I was trying to big us up, I could say yes, it was slightly harder because there wasn't as much ground truth. There wasn't as much of a history of filming in Asia, although by no means there was a lot of filming had been done over the years. So that would be to big us up. But then on the other side, to be a bit more humble about it, it did make things slightly easier for us, because the thing we were always striving for in natural history is authentic new stories, either new creatures or new places or new behaviours. That's our bread and butter, because we've got a very intelligent audience and they watch a lot of natural history, and we need to be careful not to repeat. So in that sense, Asia was a gift, because it was easier to find stories that hadn't been mined previously for film and television.
That makes sense, actually. I mean, because how many times have we seen, the wildebeest migrations on the Serengeti, and how many times have we, watched a boat floating up the Amazon? That's absolutely true. So yeah, that would be kind of freeing to have less expectation because you're not having to rethink the wheel, I guess.
Exactly. I think we look back sometimes when we are struggling to find news stories, and we idolise the folks in the 1960s who are going out with kind of cookie tins full of film, old Super 16 film stock, and they were just off into these new lands, and you could kind of film anything, and nobody knew what a Komodo dragon was, or if they did, they certainly hadn't seen it being filmed before. So you could just kind of film everything, and it would all work. That's enormously diminishing their exploits in a world before reliable transatlantic phone calls or the internet or anything like that. What they did was quite remarkable. But when we're feeling, that it's tough to find a new story, we are still a bit envious of them.
Well, so let's talk about the relationship between the TV series, which is Wild Asia, and the film that you will be coming here to speak about, and that will be showing at our theater on May 15th, which is Wild Asia Life at Extremes. How are those two projects distinct from one another in your mind? Because, again, you worked as a producer on the TV series and you directed the film. How are they distinct?
Well, the TV series was, I think, in the United States was Planet Earth Asia. In the UK, we kind of went with Asia. Subtle difference. And I was a series producer on that, so I kind of oversaw the editorial on that 7-part series. And in the production, partway through the production of that series, once we were really getting our heads around how epic the landscapes were and how characterful a lot of the creatures in that continent were and what a diverse place it was, we identified this would work really well as a giant screen film. So the giant screen film was kind of born out of the television series. Obviously, it has a kind of different. It's a different media, basically. It's 3D, gigantic screen, different aspect ratio, different running time. But nonetheless, we could see that the stories we were finding for the TV series, some of those would work if treated in a different way with very great effect on a giant screen. So that's the kind of relationship there.
So did you, in the course of making the TV series, begin to see the through-line narrative that would work as a film? Or was it the case that after the TV series was done, then you went back and started looking at it with the eye towards a second project that would work on a giant screen?
It was during the TV series, but towards the end. And it's interesting, with a giant screen film, I mean, there's different ways of approaching it. You've got 40 minutes. You want to pack as much in as possible. You don't want to leave anything out there. But if you just sort of scatter it in randomly, it's a somewhat unsatisfactory viewing experience, almost at the subliminal level. It just becomes too much like a magazine. And that's something these place-based landmark productions, the wildlife series, it's always a battle to try and remove it out of that magazine format. You want it to feel linked and tell a story and make it cohesive. It's a much more satisfying experience. So in the end, on Wild Asia for the giant screen, we looked at various different ways that we could package the stories together. We looked at different themes, we looked at seasonality, things like that. But in the end, it's a very simple theme actually that takes us through, and it's a geographical theme to match a geographical film. And we move from west to east across the continent through the show. That is how we've linked those stories. It's quite subtle. We don't explicitly tell the audience that we're taking them on that west to east journey, but we make it quite clear in some of the maps that we use. And at the end, you do feel that you've travelled through the continent, and you've got a snapshot, albeit in only 40 minutes, of the kind of highlights of the different creatures that live there and the different habitats that are found there. So that's how we package that. Whereas with the television series, it's 7 parts, it's episodic. We broke it down by region, and within each region we had different ways of moving through. Sometimes it was seasonal, sometimes it was geographical.
So I had the benefit of streaming the film ahead of time. I watched it yesterday, and what was impressive to me was that as someone who has had to make videos, albeit at a much smaller level for the aquarium, is just the editorial work that had to have gone into compacting a continent, the world's largest continent, into such a small space, a short runtime. I mean, I can't, even to take that size of a story, that big of a place, and render it down, even into a 7-part series, having 7 hours to work with doesn't feel like enough time. I mean, it just feels like an absolute accomplishment of editorial work.
Thank you. It's a nice problem to have, hey? I mean, to kind of squeeze all this fantastic material down to 40 minutes. But we built a kind of matrix, like a grid, because you want to highlight variety, don't you? So you want to make sure you're not overloading the whole film with mammals. You want to make sure you've got, you don't want everything to be terrestrial. Maybe you want some aquatic creatures as well. So you've got to kind of, okay, you're immediately thinking, well, maybe I have 3 or 4 mammals. Maybe I'll have a fish here or some weird kind of invertebrate here. And then you also, especially for Asia, it's such a remarkably diverse place. It goes up from, the equator right down towards the Antarctic. It's remarkable, the latitude that continent covers. We knew we needed different habitat. We wanted deserts, we wanted forests, we wanted the polar regions, we wanted the tropics, we wanted mountains. So again, that's the second part of the matrix, and you begin to block it out and you look at what creatures can we choose, which give us the greatest variety of habitats as well. And then, of course, you've got a variety of behaviours. You can't have everything being a parental care story or everything being a predation story. So once you start limiting yourself and saying, well, look, who are our favourite 3 mammals? What's our favourite 2 predation stories? What's our favourite parental care story? You very quickly start whittling things down and streamlining it. Which is sad to see stories fall by the wayside, but ultimately the audience doesn't know what the audience doesn't see. So you have to sort of get over that and just try and put the best material on the screen.
What's impressive to me about it, I mean, besides, again, that the editorial work that had to go into condensing it down into such a short runtime, is just the fact that despite being only 40 minutes long, somehow it doesn't feel rushed, which is, a little surprising when you think about the fact that you are covering that vast of a landscape or a variety of landscapes and so many different species. Somehow it doesn't feel hurried, which I just don't know how you accomplish that.
Thank you. I'm pleased. Yes, I think one way we try and accomplish that is to reduce the word count in the narration. If you actually look at our scripts, they're very sparse. You might only say 50 words per minute, something like that. You really try and streamline that so that the pictures tell the story. You can't always have the pictures tell the story, of course. You need to interpret them and add colour with the words. But less is more. So by having fewer words, that you're not just continuously firing words at the audience, gives them time to think and to just enjoy the imagery, and also being very clear. Have to be very clear and quite brutal in the storytelling. Whose story is it? Very quickly establish whose story is it, what world do they inhabit, and what's their problem, and really get to the nub of things rather than having a number of multiple beats. Sometimes on television you've got a bit more time to tell those stories and you can bring in other beats and secondary characters, but I think on the giant screen just keeping it simple so we're not trying to say too much helps.
The Tennessee Aquarium's podcast Aquatic is made possible by support from the Tennessee Conservationist, the official magazine of Tennessee state parks. Each issue is filled with fascinating stories about Tennessee's native species, rich history, and unique culture. It's also your guide to exploring state parks and planning your next outdoor adventure. Subscribe today at tnconservationist.org.
So for people who are outside of the filmmaking industry who maybe don't understand what role a producer plays in the production of something like Wild Asia, or Asia, I guess, in the UK, can you explain what exactly your job was when you were doing or during the production of Asia, and then the role that you played specifically for this film? How were those 2 roles different for you?
Yeah, the TV series is there's kind of 2 levels. I'm a series producer, so I'm slightly more sort of concerned with managerial things on that level. I'm hiring the team, hiring the creative team that are going to achieve this series, and I'm keeping them safe. So I'm overseeing all the health and safety, which is massive on a project like this. Every single shoot has a risk assessment, and I'll be overseeing that and making sure people are following safe practices. I'll also be feeding into the creative process. The producers are pitching the stories that they've found for their respective episodes. I'll be critiquing those along with the executive producer and the commissioners who are paying for the thing, and giving feedback and making sure that each episode has its own feel and people aren't overlapping too much. I'm also responsible for hiring the wider team, so keeping things running, making sure we've got enough folks to crew the shoots and deal with all the post-production and things like that. So it's creative, but it's also managerial. I'm a kind of nexus. I'm a conduit between the people who are paying for the series and have their own vision for it, and the people who are actually on the ground making the series. And I'm trying to keep everybody safe, everyone fed and watered, and everyone achieving the same vision. So that was probably my role on the Planet Earth Asia series. But then when it came to Wild Asia, then I was responsible as the director more directly for that creative vision. what are we actually going to say in this film? Which sequences are we going to include? How are we going to edit those together? What are we going to focus on? Co-writing the scripts, even down to the level of once we're moving things into 3D, kind of you have to look at how you manage that 3D and how much you're forcing perspective, how much you're throwing things in and out of where you're putting things in three-dimensional space, basically. So even things like that, we're poring over all those decisions, working out how much we can push animals into people's faces before they feel it's a bit too much. There's much more.
So I wasn't able to watch it in 3D. I watched it in flat, I guess. I watched it in 2D at home. What are the moments that you were most excited, or what are the moments that you are most excited for people to experience in 3D that you feel really translated well with that added dimension at play?
I love the sense of movement that giant screen 3D gives you when you're moving through the landscapes. So on the face of it, on television, the sort of the drone aerial shots over the landscapes are spectacular, but on the giant screen, with a sense of movement, you kind of almost feel you're in the chopper flying over the landscape. And especially in the opening sequence is in the Hindu Kush Mountains. It's very vertical cliffs, and there's some shots where we're kind of craning over, looking down into this precipice. And when it's in 3 dimensions, you really feel vertigo, which is exactly what we want to induce, because then we introduce these remarkable Markhor goats who can climb over this terrain, and you think, how do you do that? Why don't you just fall to your death immediately? It's remarkable what you can do. So that the landscape shots, great, really, really work for me. And there's a fantastic sequence in Mongolia in the Gobi Desert with this little weird mouse-like creature called a jerboa that looks like
my favorite sequence.
That's good to know. My sort of colleague who's involved in that is working with me still, so I'll pass that on. But the jerboa is this weird thing it's a mouse that looks like it's built out of other animals, doesn't it? It's got the snout of a pig and the tail of a lion and the ears of a rabbit and so on. And it's jumping up in the air. It's trying to catch moths. And when you see this jerboa leaping in 3 dimensions, you almost feel it's going to, come down and land on top of you. It's so removed from the television. What you can do in television, I think the 3D is quite remarkable. Hand in hand with the giant screen, those two things to me are just so powerful.
Sure. I mean, you mentioned earlier that you were concerned largely with figuring out what were your favorite stories of a certain type to tell, to include in the film. What was the most difficult choice to make where you had to leave something behind that you would ideally have been able to include in the giant screen film? That you had to say, in the interest of time, we have to leave this, even though I really love it.
I wouldn't give specific examples, but I'd say with giant screen, it's very hard to tell stories of creatures that are really close up to you. So where they're kind of filling the frame, because the framing is it's very difficult to make that work on a giant screen. So there are some stories that didn't work so well because they needed to be told in extreme close up, and in giant screen, because of the way the image kind of wraps up and around the audience, that doesn't translate so well. So we had to kind of leave them behind. That's kind of where I'd go with that one, I think. But I think mostly, once the dust settled, and I've rewatched the film. It's been a while since we finalised the film, and I've sort of rewatched it in advance of talking to you because I didn't want to appear that I didn't know my own film, which would be embarrassing. And I felt so warm rewatching it and so pleased with what we got in. I kind of think, we did acquit ourselves pretty well there. I wasn't left sad.
You did, for sure. And it's interesting because I think when you think of a project like, look at the continent of Asia and the wildlife that exists in that continent, you probably have these ideas of animals that you would expect to see. But again, I think the ones that I connected to that were the most interesting to me were the ones that, were stories that you haven't seen 1,000 times. Your brain almost turns off. You see a giant panda on screen, you're like, okay, I register that that's a giant panda. And you kind of, your brain almost shuts down a little bit. But one of my favorites wasn't a giant panda or a tiger. It was the jerboa. And am I saying that correct? Jerboa?
Yeah.
Okay. And another one I really loved was, the toxic snow bunny that you cover in the Coral Triangle, which is, this incredibly species-rich marine habitat off the coast of Southeast Asia. We actually have an exhibit at the aquarium that's focused on the Coral Triangle in our Island Life gallery. But this little tiny sea slug that's just incredibly toxic. Those are the stories that, to me, in this film that I really personally connected with. And I'm just curious, how much of a focus was it for you as the director of this film and then looking also at the larger TV series to hit those marquee animals that people maybe expect to see, while also giving equal time or shining a spotlight on those animals that maybe were the unsung heroes, those untold stories.
Sure, it's something we grapple with. New, as I said, new is a really big deal for us. So that's either new places, new species, new behaviour. But it can't be at the expense of story, because the audiences are so sophisticated. It's not enough to just say, "Hey, look, here's a new sea slug. Isn't it cool?" And yeah, that's interesting for 30 seconds, maybe a minute, and that's cool and great. But then what does it do? So that's often the problem with news stories, is the reason they haven't been covered before isn't necessarily that we were unaware of them. It's just it's a cool creature in itself, but it doesn't necessarily do much. What can we find in its life cycle that's worth filming? So that's the challenge for us. So we were always looking for news stories, and things like the sea bunny, that weird invertebrate sea slug that's blind and yet is the kind of boss of the reef, and nothing eats it and you're not sure why until there's this reveal and you find out why. It's basically bulletproof. That's perfect for us because everything's new. But then when we were filming things like tigers, at one point tigers didn't feature at all. We just kind of felt they've been filmed so much, they're so familiar, that maybe we just don't put them in the series. And then we kind of rethought partway through, and we thought, no, we've got to get tigers in. And I'm pretty pleased with the tigers. Well, very pleased. In fact, the tigers that we have in the giant screen film aren't filmed in India. They're filmed in Nepal. India's a fantastic place for filming tigers. They've done amazing work growing their tiger population through conservation there. But Nepal is actually on a similar trajectory. And we found a new location in Nepal which hasn't been filmed at before in any great great quantity. And at that location we were able to film the tigers from the air with drones, which is something which you're not able to do in most parts of India, and that meant we could show the tigers in a new way. So it's a familiar creature but in a new place, and filmed in a way that meant we could reveal new behaviours, and that's really exciting for me as well. So I'm just as excited about a new creature that's not been seen before as a really familiar creature that we're able to show people in a different light.
I'm curious, as a filmmaker, and you said at this point you've been with the BBC Nature Unit, or how many years have you been making nature films at this point?
I've been working in, from the start, when I wasn't making, and that I wasn't the producer, but I've been working in natural history television production now for just over 25 years.
Okay, that's a long time. And what I'm always interested in talking to filmmakers about, especially ones who have been in the industry as long as you have and have this perspective of having the perspective of time, is what stories are you able to tell today thanks to technological advances? You mentioned drone shots earlier. What tools do you have access to today that make storytelling opportunities feasible that maybe wouldn't have been feasible in the past? And what are some stories that you are excited to tackle in the future that you can do now because of technological advances that you couldn't before? What are you excited about pursuing in the future?
Yeah. Oh man. I mean, I'm fortunate. It's an easy question to answer because I'm relatively old. So when I started, we were still shooting on film. We shoot on Super 16mm on basically a clockwork camera that was powered by a brick battery, and you'd take a whole suitcase full of film on every filming expedition, and when the film ran out, you were in trouble. And the cameras, like a standard camera might go to 150 frames a second, something like that, which really isn't that high. You might bring in a highly specialist camera to go to 400 frames a second. So shooting high-speed action was tricky. We obviously didn't have drones. You could film from the air if you kind of hung a camera operator outside of a helicopter at great expense. You didn't have any stabilized rigs. You didn't have miniature cameras. It was vastly different landscape. So now obviously we shoot digital. We might gather, the Asia series, I think we gathered about a petabyte of data. Just insane amounts of data because you can, and because it helps, because you're panning for gold essentially. So the more panning you do, the more gold you get. So that ability to shoot almost endlessly is fantastic for capturing animal behavior. You're not worried about when you're going to turn over. You can gather material which may prove to be useful in the edit. We can shoot in much lower light. We can shoot in the dark using military grade thermal equipment. We can shoot from the air with drones, which is fantastic. You don't have to stick somebody in a helicopter. It's much safer, it's much cheaper, it's much greener. The animals aren't generally bothered by the drones. The tigers, the markhor, that you see and in fact the Moorish idols, these 3 sequences in wild Asia were filmed with a lot of drone input. These are small, lightweight drones with zoom lenses. You can barely even tell they're here when you put them up quite high. You can zoom in with the lens. You really can barely hear them. And time and again, we saw that animals just didn't care about them, which was fantastic. You're not disturbing them. You're not disadvantaging them. You're not changing their behavior, which is, of course, is essential for filming. So drones are a massive game changer for us because we're able to follow creatures and events that you just wouldn't have been able to previously. But all those other advancements I've mentioned are really valid as well for building a greater picture of what goes on. Going forward, there's continuing developments in the drone space. The drones will fly for longer on the same battery charge. We can put longer lenses on them. They'll get quieter, so even better for filming animals unobtrusively. And no doubt we'll see camera technology continue to improve, so better low light sensitivity, higher frame rates and things like that. It really is. And it's great as well because I think it's democratizing image capture to an extent. So when I started, if you were a budding camera operator and you wanted to go out and film some wildlife, you would be burning through a 10-minute roll of film that would last you maybe 5 minutes. A 400-foot roll of film that would give you 5 minutes at 60 frames a second would be costing you, I don't know, maybe $200 in today's money just for the film, and then another $200 to get it processed afterwards. So how are you supposed to afford that? And then what are you going to do with it when you've made it? You don't have any video editing technology because you don't own a computer. Whereas nowadays, you can get a second-hand digital SLR with a long lens and you can head out shooting for a few $100 and you can compete with, as long as you've got the eye and the access, you can compete and make yourself a showreel, which is going to really show off what you can do. So I think it's democratic. We're seeing a broader diversity of folks coming in on the camera side. We're seeing people in local countries outside of the UK, outside of the US, who are doing great work filming, and we're working with those people. And it's brilliant having local talent on the ground filming because they have a better understanding of the animals they've grown up around. They have a better cultural understanding of when you can and can't film. They're much more reactive because the nature is on their doorstep. They're arguably more passionate because it's right there in their world. And it's just a great recipe because we're able to work with and equip local filmmakers, and in turn they're filming great material and allowing us to capture sequences we wouldn't have otherwise. And that does spin out of all the technological advances, because back in the days of shooting on film, that would have been impossible.
What's the best example from life at extremes that speaks to that use of local talent and having their experience and their eye for the wildlife to draw on?
Certainly, when we filmed the snow leopard sequence in India, there was a local crew on that, and people who were used to real passionate snow leopard experts. If you stick around for the end credits, which is great because you get to see all the names of my colleagues, you'll see a chap right at the end of the credit roller with kind of frozen icicles coming out of his nose, talking about how he can't feel his feet because he's so cold, but that doesn't matter because there's a snow leopard right in front of him, and you can see the passion that he has. And so that was kind of integral in that sequence. You'll see also in the credit roller, when we filmed in China for the Tibetan fox, lots of local crew worked on that, and without their expertise, their local knowledge, their passion, that sequence would have been nigh on impossible as well. We worked with local crew filming the long-tailed tits in Japan, the long-tailed tit bird. So there's as much as we can, we love to use local crews. It works so well on so many fronts.
I was so glad, speaking of that end credit sequence, that you did show the camera operators, because one of my favorite things about Planet Earth, and I know I can't possibly be alone in this, when I was maybe 21, I asked my parents for the DVD set of Planet Earth for my birthday, and they gave it to me. And one of my favorite things was I loved the actual episodes focusing on the wildlife, but I also really enjoyed the featurettes that accompanied each of those episodes, showing the effort that went into getting the shots that you were just seeing and taking at face value, and not thinking about or unaware of the crazy links that had to be gone through to capture that imagery. I loved that you, in the credit sequence for this film, you get a chance to see some of the people behind the film. Was that just in keeping with the BBC Nature Unit's tradition, or was that important to you as the director to show those people?
Yeah, absolutely. It's important. It's a great way to give a nod to the people behind the scenes. It's also just being a creative, isn't it? You want to make things as interesting and fun for the audience as possible. And let's be honest, credits are not particularly interesting or fun unless you're a real geek and you want to kind of check out who filmed something or who the production accountant was. But if we can overlay some fun behind the scenes footage on, then it's just like a little bonus extra for folks that are prepared to sit through the names. And yeah, it is a little almost subliminal nod to the fact that it takes an enormous team to make these things, and it's not just a bunch of folks in Bristol heading out like Victorian explorers to bag all these animals and then come home. It's this big collaboration now that spans continents that reaps rewards. So I've always loved those bits too, and it's surprising the number of people who work here who, well, it's not surprising I guess, but there's a number of people who work here now who as kids watched those behind the scenes segments and then kind of a light bulb went on and think, oh yeah, of course someone actually has to make these things. Like who does, that's a job that exists. Like how do I get into that? So that's always cool, meeting people who've kind of seen you on a behind the scenes segment years ago and remember you.
So I'm interested, you mentioned the aspect ratio of a giant screen film is different than what you see on a TV in your home. An aspect ratio is just the dimensions of the image, basically. So the length and the height, or the width and the height, basically, to boil it down for some of you who don't work with editing film. And when you were filming the TV series, did you also have cameras out that were shooting specifically for large format, or how did you take the footage that existed for the TV series and make it work in a giant screen, make it work for a giant screen film?
Well, this is another area of technological advance that's really helped. So now, when we delivered the TV series, we're delivering in UHD, so that's kind of 4K, sort of 4 times the resolution of your HD. But we shoot way above that. We use cinema cameras because we always want to acquire kind of future-proof our acquisitions, and also it just gives the best possible image. So we tend to shoot anywhere 5, 6, 7, even 7.5, 8K. That's where we require it at slightly different levels because different cameras have different sensor sizes, and sometimes depending on what lens you put on the camera, some lenses don't actually cover the whole of an 8K sensor. They kind of project a circle into the middle and you have to crop in slightly. But we're generally acquiring at very high resolution, and that is fantastic for a giant screen conversion because it gives us the bandwidth to reframe basically for giant screen and still give a fantastically crisp image. So you can kind of throw away the sides because the giant screen is more almost square shape, but still yield a pin sharp image that you can project onto this 6-story screen and not have everyone wondering why the projector's out of focus. So you could kind of shoot for both. That said, that it's interesting how different the framing is for giant screen. The next time you go and enjoy a giant screen movie, if you really sort of analyze it, if you do want to get technical about it, most of the action is in the center near the bottom, because that's where the audience's eye line is. Everything kind of to the top and the sides is giving fantastic immersion. It's tricking the brain into thinking we're there, and it's giving you the imagery and the peripheral vision. But if you start moving the point of interest around too much between shots, which you might do in television, it makes everyone feel quite disoriented because your eyes are having to suddenly flick up 4 stories. So we're much more conscious when you're shooting or cropping for giant screen of keeping the action in that kind of sweet spot in the center. And it's interesting, in the edit you actually can have an overlay that you toggle on and off that kind of it breaks the screen up into a grid pattern with a big red dot in the sweet spot where people are looking to kind of make sure you're not going to too crazy, because of course we don't edit in a giant screen theatre. They don't exist. It'd be very expensive to hire a giant screen cinema to edit for several months. So we're still editing in a regular edit booth on a regular TV, and you just have to remember that that's not how the audience are going to enjoy it. And then we did do a test screening. We kind of broke out of the edit partway through and rented a giant screen, and we all went down and watched the rough cut in a giant screen just to get a sense of how it's working, to make sure we're on the right tracks. It's a fascinating process. It's good fun.
That is very interesting, especially, I've never edited for a giant screen film before, but I've edited for normal screens, and I'd never thought about the fact that you would have to take into account the fact that the eye has to move as much as it would on a giant screen film, when you're telling those stories. And speaking of stories, so I mentioned earlier that the jerboa is my personal favorite moment from the film. What's yours?
My favourite moment is, now you go, it's like pick your child. I've got a variety, but I just think the end sequence. We tried to save something punchy for the end, and it's appropriately for an aquarium. It's an aquatic sequence at the very end, and it features these remarkable little colourful reef fish called Moorish idols, and they have to go and spawn en masse in the open ocean. And you don't want to sort of spoil it too much, but they're pursued by an absolutely colossal shoal of sharks, and it's pretty terrifying. And I think I'm drawn to that sequence partly because it was so damn hard to film, but that shouldn't be a reason. We have to divorce that when we're in the edit. It doesn't matter how hard or expensive something was to film. If the story's not working, you have to throw it away or downplay it, because the audience do not care about how difficult, quite rightly, do not care about how difficult it was to film something. If the story's boring, unfortunately, it's just been a great waste of effort. But I really feel with Moorish Idols, this fish shark sequence, the effort required was extraordinary, but the end result is similarly memorable. It's a remarkable predation sequence, and it's something in the unit that has been, people have tried to film it previously and it's always failed. It's a very difficult event. It only happens maybe once or twice a year when conditions are just right relating to the moon cycle, the lunar cycle, and the team got it, and we're really proud of it. So for me, probably the end sequence is my favourite, but if you ask me next week, I might give you a different answer.
What is it about that particular behavior that makes it so difficult to capture? And I'm not going to spoil the end either. I mean, I know what happens, but why was it so difficult?
So in quite a remote part of the world, you're in the Western Pacific, and it, like I say, only happens in a very small window. So you can't repeatedly try and get it if you miss it. You've got kind of one or two chances a year. And these fish are in the open ocean, so they're really hard to find. And the event might only last a few hours. So you need to be in a boat, ideally in the right place, with drones up in the air, searching. So that's, again, drone technology makes these things possible. We're searching on drones, looking for these bright yellow fish in the open ocean. And then sometimes the event kind of happens, but it goes off a bit half-cocked. So there's not many sharks, or the Moorish Idol reef, the Moorish Idol shoal, may disperse. So you never quite know what level it's going to happen at. So you need to get lucky to find it. You need to have the resources to find it, and you need the event to be a good one. And we had all three. And we also needed quite a lot of specialist technology. So it's a very fast-moving sequence. The fish are moving pretty quickly through the water. You can't put divers in the water because the sharks are in feeding mode, so you might get bitten accidentally. Sometimes you can get in the water with sharks, but when they're out to hunt and eat, then that's obviously not possible. So we need a pole cam. So that's the underwater camera system that is what the name suggests. It's a camera on the end of a stick, but you're moving at such high speed that it's just going to snap the stick or bend the camera or induce so much vibration in the system that you get unusable shots. So we had to work with a camera operator, American camera operator actually, to design a kind of almost like a hydrofoil around the housing so that it would cut through the water more cleanly. And then do experiments with the boat to kind of work out how we could mount it in the water securely so it wouldn't vibrate, and work out the maximum speed we could travel, and do all that kind of work in advance to make sure when the event hit that we could run the boat alongside the shoal, filming them with this remote controlled underwater pole cam, and get smooth shots. And there's just nothing, a lot of what we do, the equipment we need doesn't exist because there's no commercial reason for it to exist. You don't need that kind of rig for a TV drama or a big movie. So no one's bothered to invent it because there's no commercial payoff. So a lot of the time we're kind of making these things ourselves out of, paper and string, and it's part of the fun, but part of the stress. So there's a lot of different considerations with that particular sequence that made it tough.
I'm curious, as people leave the theater after that awesome credit sequence that we've talked about earlier, what are your hopes in terms of their takeaway? So this, as we talked about earlier, is kind of the, for some people, might be their introduction to Asia, the geography and the wildlife of Asia. What are your hopes in terms of what they're thinking or potentially feeling as they leave the theater in terms of what their perspective on Asia as a place and as a collection of ecosystems?
I just want people to leave the theater with the same buzz from seeing those creatures on the big screen in 3D that we get in the field when you see them with your own eyes. And I do think no matter how good your storytelling is, that's really hard to achieve on TV or through a book or a podcast or a webisode. But I just think on the giant screen is the closest you can get. It sounds cheesy, but if people get people to walk out of the theatre with the same feeling that I do when you look a tiger in the eye in the wild, I do think that might be possible. And then if we can get them to experience that buzz, because they've taken their time and they've paid their money and they've come along to watch this thing, I just want them to feel something and to feel moved and maybe just in that moment exhilarated and lifted, and that would make it worthwhile. And then if then it's a bonus if beyond that it sparks something in someone to go find out more about a creature you've seen, or learn a bit about the place, or go to an exhibit in the aquarium after the filming that's an Asian exhibit, and kind of take in some more information from that continent. And then maybe it might spool out to exploring conservation options. Maybe you want to take a kind of conservation friendly holiday, or look at different conservation projects that you might want to support. Those things are all a bonus, but I think none of those things happen if people aren't engaged and grabbed and exhilarated by natural history. So maybe that's my hope, is that happens through this film to folks. Maybe that's a bit of a grand ambition, but I think it's possible when you see it on the giant screen. As to Asia, I think we're just chuffed that people watching the series, and I think feedback from people watching early screenings of the film, it just they are amazed by how rich and colossal and wild Asia is. It's a continent some of us in the West don't know so much about, or we only know bits about very small, discrete parts of that continent, and just kind of giving it its rightful place in people's minds. When they might think of fantastic continents for wildlife and conservation, you might think of Africa, quite rightly, but also give Asia a chance too. It deserves to be seen in that same context as a remarkable place where you can see what the wildlife is like.
Well, we've covered a pretty broad swath of Asia in the course of this discussion, and obviously the filmmaking that was done, you collected a lot of footage of Asia. I'm sure that there's a lot of stuff that never even made it onto the TV series, and certainly never made it into the giant screen film. Is there the possibility of a follow-up? I mean, could you work with what you've already recorded and make a second series using the unused footage? I mean, would you go back and film a second series?
Oh my gosh, I would love that. What a dream. Yeah, well, let's see. These giant screen projects are a labour of love. They're time consuming and they're relatively costly. Let's see how wild Asia does, but there's way more we could bring, either through material we've already filmed, or definitely from specific shooting. There's more stories to be told. There's always more stories to be told. Sometimes I lie awake at night and I just think there's animals somewhere in the world right now doing things that if we had a film crew there, we'd be filming something that nobody's ever seen before and probably wouldn't believe. You think how many wildlife habitats there are on this planet and how few people there are observing them. We don't know half of what goes on out there. So no doubt there's a lot of potential for a wild Asia too.
That's funny. I'd never thought of that being an occupational hazard of being a filmmaker with, the outfit that you're working with, the Natural History Unit, that you do have so many stories that I'm sure you would love to tell if only the logistics would line up and the opportunity were to be set forth in front of you. Oh,
for sure. There's so many stories that get away, that we can't cover because they're just too risky or too tricky. But they're happening. We just can't tell it.
Well, as we wrap up this episode of the podcast, let's go ahead and talk about what are you working on currently, what's coming down the pipeline that people can look to. That's Matthew Wright's next endeavor.
There's a link here, actually, because my next project hasn't come out yet, but it's airing pretty soon. I'm not sure quite when. It hasn't been confirmed. Probably over the summer. And it's a 2-part series called Tiger Island that's going to go out on PBS in the United States and the BBC in the UK, and I'm sure other territories as well. And it's spun out of Asia. It's spun out of wild Asia. So those same tigers that we filmed in Nepal, it was such an incredible place with such a wealth of tigers and possibility that we ended up making a two-part series about those tigers and the remarkable local guides who are kind of working to conserve them and working to increase awareness in the local communities of what the tigers need to continue to thrive. And we took a team of we basically brought a team together of local experts, big cat scientists from the UK, and several different camera operators to kind of flood that part of Nepal with drones and long lenses and stabilized camera systems to really see what tigers get up to 24/7 over a period of several months. And we filmed them doing totally new behaviors and gained a window into tigers' lives I really think we haven't had before. So there you go, another child of Wild Asia. So if you like the tiger sequence and you want to see those exact same tigers a couple of years later down the line, then tune into Tiger Islands.
Very cool. And that is a very cool sequence in Life at Extremes. It's a mother and anybody who's got teenage children at their house who maybe lie around more than they should and don't contribute to the upkeep of the house can probably feel a lot of resonance with the tigers in the film. So with that, Matthew, I'll go ahead and wrap up by just saying thank you for taking the time to join us here on the podcast Aquatic and for sharing some insights into the making of both the TV series Wild Asia as well as the IMAX film Wild Asia Life at Extremes, which again will begin showing here at the Tennessee Aquarium IMAX 3D Theater on May 15th, and as well as a special screening that you will be attending here on Tuesday, May the 5th. And the details for that are on our website, which is tnaqua.org/IMAX. Matthew, thank you again so much for taking the time.
Thank you, Casey. It's been a total pleasure, and hopefully meet you in person soon.
If you have an idea for a future episode of the Podcast Aquatic, send that to me at podcast@tnaqua.org. While you're online, go ahead and write us a review or leave us a rating if you don't have time to write a review. Both of those are free and easy ways to support the show and improve our reach with the algorithm so that more people can hear us. And in the meantime, until next time, remember that every drop matters.